We are now going to register our block. To get started, open your command line and cd into the blocks directory. Then run the command npm run dev. This should make Webpack look out for any changes. Once you have that ready, open the index.js file inside the app directory. I'm going to empty this file out. To register a block, we'll need to include a few things and then call a function. If we want to, we could write the code inside this file. However, as you may know by now, I like to keep things organized and structured. We're going to place every block we create into its own file. We'll be using the index file as a way to import everything. This file will look similar to the main plugin PHP file. It'll just be a lot of import statements. Inside the app directory, create a folder named recipe-block, and inside that directory, create a file named index.js. You don't have to name it like this. This is just how I prefer to name things. Now we'll have to import the index file. Back inside the main index file, I'm going to add a comment that says main file. We're going to have a lot of files named index.js, so this will help us differentiate between this file and the other files. Below this, I'm going to use the import statement and pass in the path to the file. Alright, things are a bit different here. Previously, when we went over modules, I told you there are various ways to import files. We're using the ES6 method of importing modules. However, I'm not using the from keyword, nor am I storing the data in a variable. If you were to just call the import statement by itself, then JavaScript will still process the contents of that file, but it will not return the data. This means that if you were to export any data from that file, then we won't be able to use it here. That's perfectly fine. We don't need to import any data from that file. The great thing about this is that we'll still have access to all other modules even though we're not passing any data from this module to the one being imported. Another thing I want to note is the file name. I'm not including the index.js file name. By default, JavaScript will assume that you want to load a file named index.js if you don't specify one. By organizing our code like this, we can just provide the directory name and JavaScript will take care of the rest. If you want, you can include the file name if it makes things more readable. Alright, let's shift our focus to the recipe block index file. WordPress puts everything into a single variable called WP. Let's log that variable. Even though we're using Webpack and a lot of other modules, keep in mind that we're loading this file with WordPress. Just like any other JavaScript file, we'll have access to any functions or variables that are defined globally. Save your changes and refresh the editor. Open your developer tools and view the console tab. If everything worked, then you should see an object being logged. This object contains a whole lot of other objects that will help us build blocks. The main object I want you to focus on is the blocks object. This object contains a list of functions for helping you build your own block that will work with the Gutenberg editor. Let's go ahead and use this object. Inside the recipe block, I'm going to comment out the log. Then I'm going to call the wp.blocks.registerBlockType function. This function will register a block for us. We just need to pass in a few settings and we'll be set. Before we move on to that, let's check out the documentation for this. Gutenberg is still relatively new. However, it's probably one of the best documented parts of WordPress. There are 2 locations you'll find yourself going through to find more information. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide links to these resources. The first resource is the handbook. The handbook is the developer-friendly resource for Gutenberg. Lots of examples and overviews on the basics. This is probably where you'll find yourself going as a beginner. The second resource is the GitHub repository for Gutenberg itself. Before we dive into this project, I do want to note one thing. The code you find here and the code inside your WordPress installation are completely different. The code here is raw without any compilation. You'll find that the file size here is bigger than the one that's loaded with WordPress. The code inside WordPress is compressed and minified. I do not recommend looking at the code inside WordPress. Instead, I recommend you check out the GitHub repository. Throughout this course, I'll be referring both resources, so be sure to bookmark them both. Earlier, if you recall, we logged the WP global variable. A lot of the various objects you found inside that object can be found inside the packages directory of the Gutenberg plugin. I'm going to click on the blocks directory. The blocks directory contains all the functions you saw inside the blocks object. Most packages come with their own documentation that you may not be able to find inside the handbook. Now that we know where the code is for creating blocks, let's examine a block in the editor. Switching back to the editor, you'll find a plus icon at the top left corner. Clicking on this will display a list of blocks that come by default with Gutenberg. Something I want you to notice is that blocks are categorized into things like common, formatting, embeds, etc. This is important to note as when we're creating blocks, we'll be asked where we'll want to place our block. It's always good practice to place your block in an appropriate category. Back on the GitHub page, you can find the code for these blocks inside the packages/block-library/source directory. After you finish this course, I recommend you check out the code here to see how WordPress goes about creating their own blocks. Let's check one out really quickly. I'm going to select the audio block. The general architecture WordPress goes for here is an index file and then some SCSS files. I don't expect you to know what SCSS is. It's just another file type for CSS. I'll be briefly going over it later on in this course, but for now you can ignore it. Let's check out the index file. Inside this file, you'll find that WordPress imports some variables which we'll also be using in our own blocks. Then it proceeds to create some settings. We'll be exploring this more in depth later, but for now I just want to give you a general idea of what we'll be writing. Let's go back to the blocks directory. Most directories here come with a file named readme.md. These files provide more information about a project. The great thing about GitHub is that it will automatically render any README files below. Let's scroll down to the API section. Here you'll find a list of functions you can use in your own code. Right away you'll see the register block type function. There are two parameters which are both required. The first is the name and the second is an object filled with the settings. Before we fill in the settings, there's one more thing I want you to be aware of. I know I'm rambling here, but knowing how to navigate your way around will help you later on if you want to build advanced blocks. Scrolling back up, click on the API directory. The API directory contains code related to how you can interact with the blocks of WordPress. There should be a file here called registration.js. This is the file that contains the register block type function. If you take a close look at this function, you'll find that it performs a lot of conditional checks on your statements. If it finds something wrong, then it'll throw an error. One error I want to highlight in particular is this one that checks for the block name. It says the following: block names must contain a namespace prefix, include only lowercase alphanumeric characters or dashes, and start with a letter. Example, my-plugin/my-custom-block. I wanted to highlight this as we'll be using this function very soon. Let's go back to the blocks directory. To recap, the API directory contains the functions for interacting with this part of Gutenberg, which are blocks. The block-library directory contains all the default blocks for Gutenberg. The rest of the packages are components that we can use to help build our own blocks. You'll soon understand what that means as the course progresses. Now that we have an overview of things, let's start using this function. The first parameter is the name. The name needs to be formatted as the namespace followed by the name of the block. For the rest of this course, we'll be using the namespace Udemy. The name of this block will be Udemy/recipe. The second parameter for this function is the settings. You must pass this in as an object. We're going to stop here for now. This is how you register a block. Unfortunately, this will not work as Gutenberg will throw an error because we need to set a few settings. So far, we've gone over how to prepare the environment, enqueue the files, and register a block. The next step is to add some settings. We'll be going over that in the next lecture.